the Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee, and thanks to all who are watching from home. I know all of you, but for the record, we'll just say I'm Jessica Sutter, Ward 6 member on the DC State Board of Education and co-chairperson of the Social Studies Standards Advisory Council, along with my colleague Karen Williams, who represents Ward 7. Excited tonight to jump in with all of you and start working towards a final draft of our guiding principles to put out for public input. And to get the chance tonight to dig in on a few places where we did not reach consensus last time. Also to get some feedback from you all on the relative importance of the guiding principles we've drafted. If we were to shrink down the list to a shorter number, understanding sort of where your priorities lie, what is essential for you to make sure we include in our communications to OSSE, and what you could be willing to live without or combine with another guiding principle so that we can seek to send on the most concise, but also essential list of principles to OSSE for their writing committee. Speaking of which, we will also hear from OSSE tonight about their plans for assembling a technical writing committee and beginning work on that next year. We've got them slotted in around 6:30 this evening. And we'll talk briefly about the public comment process and how that will feed into the next steps for our work together. Our objectives tonight are at the top of your agenda, so I will not read them to you, but these are the same basic list of things I just went over. Our goal tonight is to get to a final draft of guiding principles that we feel comfortable sharing with the public so that we can get their input on how they feel about the relative importance of these various guiding principles. And so that that can inform a conversation with the state board about what questions they may have, what feedback they may have before we finalize these as an advisory committee and before the board votes to adopt a resolution on these guiding principles to forward on to OSSE in December. We're down to the wire now. These are all the members of our advisory committee assembled here. We have most folks in attendance tonight. A few folks who told us ahead of time that they weren't able to attend have been given the chance to participate in giving their ratings of the various guiding principles in advance, and we've had back and forth conversation with them today. So we do want to make sure that everyone on the SISAC has ample opportunity to have their voices heard in this process. Our norms for the night, I think we have really done a nice job adhering to these, so I ask that folks do the same tonight. Specifically around making space and taking space. If you find yourself talking a lot, make sure that you're making space for others to chime in, whether in the chat or in the conversation. We won't be breaking out into small groups tonight, so it is a large group conversation the entire time. Okay, so one of the things I did between our last SISAC meeting and tonight is I shared the draft guiding principles document, the one that you're looking at now, with our members of the State Board of Education. We specifically talked about it in detail in our Social Studies Committee meeting, and then shared it out with every member of the board. We got some feedback, both a written set of suggestions, as well as some spoken comments from members of the board. And the kinds of things they highlighted were the number of principles. One of our members specifically wondered if we could condense them down because some of them seemed repetitive, but also wondered if we might not have sort of bigger impact if we get to a concise number of principles that we shared with the writing committee. To that end, there was a question of whether it would be possible for the SISAC to create a distillation of the most essential principles. And that's a little bit of what we're going to try to do tonight with our ranking exercise, partially in response to members of the state board and the feedback they provided. The other thing we heard from members of the board was an interest in stating something in narrative form upfront before the principles to share with the OSSE what we believed were the most important threads that should run through any revised standards, whether we had any other statements of principle or philosophy that we wanted to share with the OSSE about the new standards. And so we got some suggested language from members of the board about that. You'll see that in the draft preamble that's at the top of this new guiding principles document. So as we talk tonight, I'd also welcome feedback on what is in there, what is missing, what you think of what members of the board and some of your colleagues on the SISAC suggested, and where you think we may have either said too much or not enough about something. But that was Sally's suggestion at the last meeting for a preamble, echoed by members of the board, and thus we end up with the draft we're at today. The other thing we received in terms of feedback from the board was a desire for members of the SISAC to engage directly with members of the board at our December working session. They specifically wanted to make sure that members of the SISAC were present in the meeting to hear feedback from board members as we review the public feedback on the guiding principles and have discussion amongst ourselves, as well as being able to engage in dialogue with board members. So if you have an interest in attending our December working session to represent your colleagues on the SISAC, I'd love to hear that from you. You can drop a note in the chat now. You can send me an email thereafter. What it would mean is committing to be present, and John Paul and Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, our working session is December 2nd. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, it's Wednesday evening, December 2nd. We begin at 5 p.m. We would be able to tell you the general time frame ahead of time. Meeting starts at 5, usually goes to somewhere around 8. The working session is not a place where we typically have public comment or public witnesses, but we do invite people in to share research, data, information. And that's what we would ask for here, is for representatives from the SISAC to come, present the guiding principles, and be present for some dialogue. So if that's something you are interested in, we've got a couple folks writing in the chat already. Feel free to send me a note. You can send it privately if you don't want to send it publicly, or you can shoot me an email letting me know that's something you would be interested in. One thing I would probably ask is that as we prepare for it, that you work with myself and Karen to reach out to members of the SISAC and just make sure that in addition to sharing your own thoughts on the guiding principles, that you're also sort of dialed into anything your colleagues who cannot make the working session want to see raised before the members of the board. Any questions about presenting at the working session from folks? Okay, if folks have more thoughts on that later or additional questions, feel free to send them my way. Alex, anything else to add on feedback from members of the board that I may have forgotten?
No, Jessica, I think what you said is pretty accurate.
Cool. Okay. All right, so let's go on then to guiding principles. This is the same definition of the guiding principles that we've used since the start of our discussions as a collective. Our goal is to have statements that provide OSSE and their technical writing committee with information on how to revise the existing standards. And we want those statements to be clear and actionable for the people writing the standards. So as we go through our discussions tonight, I ask that you keep those two things in mind so that we can hold ourselves accountable to say if we're there or not there yet. We have had a long list of guiding principles, and we've gotten it down to roughly 21 if we collapse some of the ones we've suggested. If we can get this list down by a few, fantastic. If we end up at 21, I still think we'll be okay. But that's our goal tonight, is to clean things up, to make sure that we're landing on a set of guiding principles we all feel are important to advance, one, to the public for their feedback, and then two, on to OSSE and their writing committee. And there's two ways we're going to go about this tonight, getting to this final list. First, we're going to ask you to do sort of an individual read and rate. We'll talk more about how to do that in just a second. Then, while Alex is doing magic behind the scenes with your ratings and tabulating them all in a nice visual format for us to review together, we're going to talk about the guiding principles where there was not consensus yet, where I did a bunch of work rewording what was written in those spaces. Just so you know and have a little window into that work, I reached out to folks via email who raised specific objections or concerns about specific principles, had conversations with folks, took email comments from folks, took written comments from folks, and tried to create prose that used your language, but hung together in coherent fashion. So that's what you'll see in this draft guiding principles document tonight. It is your words with my editorial approach to putting it all together. I tried to put a heading on each of the guiding principles so that we have a short form to refer to them. And you'll notice we dropped the numbers from the right-hand column, which referred to the spreadsheet where you'd all put your notes, because at this point, it's such an amalgamation that we really wanted it to start to stand on their own as guiding principles. So our goal tonight is to first do some private rating, and then to discuss the ones without consensus, and then come back and see where we land. If folks have ratings that are wildly divergent, some of you love a particular guiding principle and others kind of feel sort of meh about it, that's information that would be helpful to have. But if all of you feel like one of the guiding principles is just sort of meh or not important, then I think it raises the question for us of should we advance it to OSSE? So that'll be our final decision-making process, is based on our discussion and your ratings. Where are we? What do we need to do to have principles ready to share with the public? So here's how the rating is going to work. Alex is going to put a poll in the chat for you all. It's a Google form that you've become quite familiar with at this point. We're going to ask you to use the Google form in the chat to rate the principles on one of 3 numbers. The first being definitely include this principle. The second being would be good to include it. And the third being do not include this principle. I don't think it's a good one for us to include. We're hoping you will keep to 10 number ones. So preferably you're not giving 20 something number ones. Preferably you're keeping to 10 number ones. If the item has an asterisk, it means we haven't reached consensus on this yet. So we're going to discuss it, but you're also giving your own individual perception. And I talked you through what it's going to let us do. You'll notice when you look in the guiding principles document, if you want to cross-reference them as you rate, that there are a few that I have recommended we collapse, that the language has been incorporated elsewhere. If you're in concurrence with that, if you think we should collapse it, I would encourage you to vote 3 on that particular principle, so it all plays out nicely in our later discussions. But if you don't think we should collapse it, if you think that needs to stand alone, please give it a 1 or a 2 so that I also have that information. Are there any questions about how to rate your principles? All right, so I'm going to go quiet for about 10 minutes and let you do that. The time is 5:16. We'll come back together at 5:26. teachers in our group are always teaching me new things. In the participant list, if you are done, you can go ahead and check the green checkbox for yes, so I can keep track of who is done. Becca, I'm stealing that idea from you. If you are not done, you have about 3 more minutes. Got about 1 more minute. If you need more time, just send me a note in the chat. Okay, we're going to give folks another minute. Okay. I only heard from one person that they needed some more time, so I'm going to go ahead and bring us back towards discussion. But if you're still working, feel free to go ahead and mute me for a second, fill out the rest of your form, and then join us back. We'll just start talking through some of the guiding principles that are open for discussion at this point. So I want to talk for a few minutes about the guiding principles where we had not yet reached consensus. And then I want to talk a little bit about principles in light of a set of questions that OSSE shared with the state board that they hoped that the SISAC would come to answers on. So we'll talk about both of those pieces now. I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint for a second so that I can take us into the guiding principles document. And I'm going to share my screen for that so that we can all look at the doc together. Okay, so you should now be looking at my marked up copy of the guiding principles. So I want to come back to the preamble. I know it's a little bit counterintuitive since it starts the document, but I want to take a few minutes to talk through specific guiding principles where we hadn't had consensus, and then we'll come back up to the question of the preamble. So the first guiding principle where we did not have consensus was number 3. And this was about the tension between flexibility and consistency. I put some language in the proposed preamble that seeks to address this sense from the SISAC that we want to make sure that our standards are manageable in number, clear and high in their cognitive asks of students, but also that we provide adequate flexibility for teachers to be able to implement these, whether they're in a school with a particular kind of curriculum like expeditionary learning or Montessori, but also that teachers can incorporate elements of the moment in time or projects that come their way. So I'm going to highlight the section here. This is the piece of the preamble that attempts to take that tension we were wrestling with in number 3 and communicate it without having it as a guiding principle. In reading that and thinking about whether you're comfortable eliminating number 3, have you had a participant list or drop a note in the chat just so I can see you all, because otherwise I'm going to have a hard time seeing all of you at once. Oh, sorry, Lamar. The instructions. Reading this highlighted piece of the preamble and considering whether or not we should keep guiding principle number 3, or if we can get rid of it because we've got language in the preamble. Love to hear any opinions on that. And you can either raise your hand in the chat or drop a note. Raise your hand in the participant list or drop a note in the chat. Let me ask one perhaps more simple question. Does anyone oppose eliminating number 3? Okay, I got one no. I see no raised hands, no yeses. This is a beautiful document that I can always come back to it if we need to, but I am going to just get rid of number 3. So number 3 is done. Fantastic. Let's move on to more interesting conversations. Number 5. Number 5, there seems to be a real difference of opinion. In open question number 1, that's this yellow part down here. This was the small group that you broke out into at our last meeting, where folks talked about the tension between grade level or grade band. And where we seemed to land was standards by grade level and skills by grade band. We're going to come back to that one in a second. But this number 5, where we didn't reach consensus, was a question of, should we avoid collapsing content and skills? Or should we have separate content and skills? And we don't have an answer on it. Even when I spoke to folks, who had raised concerns, people came out on both sides of this issue. So my question for you is, what should we do about number 5? If you have a thought on keeping content and skills integrated, one of your colleagues noted that the AP does a nice job of this in skills integration, and use the example of AP US History, or if you think we should keep them separate so that they can be done at grade bands, first grade levels. Would love to hear some discussion. So Jessica, you have the floor first.
All right, thank you, Jessica. One suggestion or reflection that emerged from our small group when we were discussing these principles was at the high school level, and this has been my experience as well, sometimes students aren't neatly in a specific grade. And so I wonder what opportunities we have to spiral content as well as skills. And so that students get a chance to practice skills and learn content over time. And we kind of move towards a mastery based approach. So I guess what I'm asking is, at the high school level, I wonder what it would look like to honor grade bands versus like singular grades.
It's a good question. Other insights or thoughts on this particular piece or responses to what Jessica shared? Scott?
I was just typing it in the chat, but I can just say it verbally. I mean, I'm okay with dropping number 5. I think I've only seen Utah state standards that really try to embed the skills right along with the content statements. And it's really too soon to tell. They've only adopted this a year or two ago, I think, how well that's working. The fear that I have is that if you lock in specific skills with specific pieces of content, that's going to really make it tough for curriculum writers and for teachers who might want to put different skills with different pieces of content. I do think that the trade-off in the way that we have it currently is that the skills oftentimes get a little bit more ignored because teachers or curriculum writers tend to focus primarily first on the content of the standards. So again, I could see it either way, but I think it might just be a question that if we can't come to consensus, it might become clearer through the writing process for the technical writing committee.
Okay. Karen?
Yeah, thank you. I am really curious about what it looks like for our students that transfer between schools and need identified credits for graduation. When we're thinking about how we're structuring courses and wanting to make sure that we're on sort of the same page. And that's just like a pure, I don't know how to think outside the box kind of moment, because I've been so in the box for so long. But knowing that we've got a lot of movement in the city between schools, want to be mindful of that.
So Karen, say more about that, meaning like, does that land you on grade level versus grade band to have clear courses? Because it feels like, just in terms of what I'm hearing and what I'm thinking about with the boxes we're talking about living in, that it makes sense to keep anything we want to call a standard associated with a course as part of a grade level, because students are taking it in the context of a given year.
Yeah, I don't know my answer. But I do know that right now students are required 4 history credits, and they are specific to the course in order to graduate. So wanting to make sure that whatever moves we make are also being made in parallel with graduation requirements and the language that's used for that. So if we are opening up what it means to get 4 history credits to graduate, like maybe you don't need World I, World II, US and US government and DC history. Maybe that we aren't saying you need these 4 specific history classes. Maybe we're saying you need 4 history classes. Then that allows for the freedom to move between schools. Whereas right now, like what we can offer is pretty pigeonholed to what we are required to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Michael, can you speak a little bit on what you put in the chat around how that might connect with what Jessica mentioned about students sort of not being at a clear grade level and what Karen was talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that that's going to be a challenge in terms of moving from grade levels or moving from a different school or LEA necessarily. If I think that there's some sort of a vertical alignment and integration with the skills as well, it really just is that idea, as I heard Scott weighing kind of the pros and cons of both, of me definitely being drawn to the second half of what he said, where it does oftentimes, if they're not integrated a la a model, kind of like the A-push one that was referenced earlier, then it does become kind of just, I feel like, empty filler in paper.
So having things as sort of an addendum or materials associated with the standards makes them a little less likely to be given primary focus.
I would agree. Yeah, I would say it's kind of like akin to, even in the current standards, some of the fluffy language at the beginning, recommending things that we've talked about in this committee before, such as like thematic standards, where it says like, hey, it's really nice if you do this, but it just is kind of like this one-off that a lot of people probably even aren't aware of they exist anymore, because all they do is jump straight to like the grade band section and focus exclusively on that.
Got it. Lizzie, you mentioned this notion of gleaning the skills without explicit instruction. Is
Yeah,
your sense that that's possible?
So I'm undecided about this. I appreciate everyone's point. I'm really thinking about Jessica's point about how do you look at this across time in a student's experience rather than individual grades, especially in high school when everything can build on each other. And I really like this idea of like a mastery set, I think you called it, or skills mastery. So I'm undecided about this, but I was just thinking about Michael's point. It's like, I wonder if it's assumed that students will derive skills from particular content. Looking at a hard history, it's assumed that students maybe will develop skills related to, I don't know, critical thinking or, conflict resolution, but it's just assumed that they'll glean that, and they may or may not. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm undecided on this, just thinking it through.
Okay. And then I want to just get clarity. Laura, you mentioned that having the flexibility to do what we need to do. Can you just say more about what that means?
Yeah, so basically to me, students are coming in at all sorts of different skill levels, especially at a school like Woodson, where we are a net receiver and we receive students from all over the district. We receive students from Maryland, Pennsylvania, you name it, right? Like we receive students throughout the year. And so if we really start to get bogged down in like exactly what skills should go with standard, and I'm then kind of tied to that, and kind of exactly how things need to be presented, that doesn't necessarily give me the flexibility to meet my students where they're at. Also, like, for example, right, like I teach world history too. I get a lot of seniors because they're coming in from other districts that didn't need 2 years of world history. I got to be able to tailor, right, to my seniors versus my sophomores. So I just think there's, I think there's something to be said for having like a clear progression and having it, tied to like a grade level. I mean, we kind of do that, with Common Core, right? Because we're supposed to integrate those. And I do agree that there should be, as teachers, we should try to be able to balance focusing on both. But I think if we were really saying like, well, in 9th grade, you have to do this, and this needs to be tied to this standard, and this is how we're going to progress. Like, I mean, I get that some people like AP. I don't. I don't use their stuff. And I don't use their skills progressions. Really, it doesn't work for me and my students. Having it as a tool, I think, is helpful, but having it as a mandate, I don't know, that'd make a lot of our jobs, I think, more difficult, especially for those of us who deal with a very wide range of skills.
Okay.
Compared with schools where it might be a bit narrower.
Okay. I want to propose something. So one of our open questions is about inquiry-based models and C3. So I want to hold our thinking on number 5, because I think everyone's given out some really good points, and I don't have an answer on it yet, but I want to come back to it after we get down to that open question and see if that discussion influences this one at all. But it's really this is super helpful. And this, I think, illuminates why there is a tension here, because it's hard. There's not a clear, easy response. I want to come to number 6 for a minute. This was, and keep the conversation, by the way, going in the chat. We'll come back and reference it. So feel free to keep dropping thoughts in there. Number 6 was about active voice and action verbs. And I spoke with the folks who seemed to raise the greatest concerns about this to make sure that we were, their understanding was the same as my understanding. So take a minute and read number 6 and let me know if there are things about number 6 that we need to discuss, wording that's not quite right or that you have questions about. Scott Abbott, is that a hand for this one?
Nope, sorry.
Okay. Vidal.
Yeah, I think it'll be really important to sort of identify why the last point about like the higher level verbs of taxonomy are important. I think like pointing out to a certain design element of social studies is really important, and like how like our charge here is to be actively anti-racist, create actively anti-racist standards. And to do that, like our students need to be able to design and imagine a more just society. And I think like that needs to be clear in that guideline.
Awesome. Would you do me a favor, Fidal? I'm going to keep conversation going on this if there is more, but would you use suggesting mode and drop in a sentence that captures that which you just said? Because I like the way you said it. Other thoughts or discussion on this one?
Okay, I actually do have a comment now.
Okay, go ahead, Scott.
So I would say on the first part sounds good.
Scott, we lost you there. Or maybe I just lost you.
Oh, hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I was just saying that in the second part around the action verbs and the Bloom's level of those verbs, that is something that has led to questions from teacher evaluation sometimes, where teachers have said that they were teaching to the Bloom's level of the standard, which was quite low. And then principals may have marked them down in their evaluation because they said the rigor of the class was too low. So I do think that's an issue that translates into, you know, the effective teacher evaluation that we need to be mindful of.
And Scott, given that, does that lead you towards, yes, this is important to include, or no?
I think it's entirely possible to include it in not in its own specific like line. And I think the first part of that I could see being a portion of some of the other rows around the precise language around attributing specific actions. So I wonder if maybe there's a way to, you know, just sort of fold that language into another one, perhaps.
Okay, super helpful. Becca's got a suggestion on maybe where we can put that. I'm going to keep us going so that we keep the conversation flowing. Alex gave me a little teaser in the chat that some of your ratings may also help guide this conversation. So I'm going to move us on to open question number 1 on organizing standards by grade level versus grade band. So this is an effort to capture all the notes, all the small groups put together, and to create a new potential guiding principle. It goes along, I think, with our question about number 5. And so I'd ask you to read it over and see if you have any questions or comments on the language of this principle as written. Because while I said this is from your language in your notes, this is something that we, myself and the staff, actually put the prose together on. Questions or comments on open question 1 here? Does it feel to you, because it kind of feels to me like open question 1 has some of the same discussion?
Jessica, I think we may have lost you for a second. Can you repeat that?
Oh my gosh. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. It feels like open question 1 has some of the same problems as number 5, but I'm not hearing any sort of agreement, disagreement, concern here, but maybe it's because you couldn't hear me. All right, hearing no reaction at all to open question 1, I'm going to shift us on to another one. Alex, just FYI, I haven't gotten an email if you sent me an email. Okay, numbers 9, 11, and 23. In people's reactions and responses, a suggestion was made to drop number 9 and number 23 with language incorporated into number 11. So take a look at 9, take a look at 23, and then read 11. And what I would like to talk about is if there's anyone who objects to dropping 9 and 23, and if there's any question you have about number 11. So looks like Scott, Lamar, Sally, are we agreeing with this or are we agreeing with the above ones?
I'm agreeing with the combining of the 3 guiding principles around student agency and community-based stuff.
All right, I'm not seeing anyone objecting to this, so I'm going to get rid of 9. I'm going to get rid of 23. I'm keeping number 11. The one other suggestion that was made around 11 was whether there was any need to make a comment in preamble or any sort of front material that would indicate some sort of comment on best practice in social studies. One thing that Barbara Davidson, who I don't think is here with us right now, and Becca, maybe you can speak to this because you and I talked about this as well, was this concern that the standards tell us what students should know and be able to do, not how pedagogically the material should be taught. And so one question here was, could we create something that was guidance on how to write the standards versus guidance on pedagogy? Does that accurately capture that, Becca? Okay. So one suggestion is if we did have more things we wanted to say about pedagogy, about the kinds of approaches we hope these standards would invite, that we would put that in the front material in the preamble, but keep the standard this way. So given that standard 11 feels like we've got good agreement on, and folks seem to feel good about that. If someone does not feel good about the language in 11, would love to hear from you.
I feel like the language in 11 is a little vague and a little fluffy, actually. I don't really know if I were a standards writer exactly what I would do with that.
Any suggestions on what kind of things might be more concrete and helpful here? I'm looking at Alex's tabulation of your rating. So 60% of you feel like this is an important guiding principle for us to include. So I do think if there are wording suggestions here, I'll invite the same thing I invited Fadal to do. Feel free to jump in with your suggesting selected on the Google Doc and make some language changes to help us move this towards concreteness. Or if you have other language suggestions, let's go ahead and drop that in there. While folks do that, I want to talk about number 10 for a moment, because number 10 had a lot of different folks with opinions on it. We made some updates and suggestions. I left Karen's suggestion particularly highlighted because it takes one particular angle on it. I had a conversation with Sally about the notion of this being the interplay between the environment and geography and humans. So it really being about sort of the impact of the environment on people and people's impact on the environment, and how all of that plays into economics and migration and other systems in the social sciences. But when you all ranked this, only 20% of you felt like this was important to include as a guiding principle. So that would suggest to me that this falls down to the bottom of our list of consideration. But I also heard from Reggie Williams, who I guess had to leave the meeting early, that he felt like this would be important because his students raised this as part of their Project Soapbox series speeches. So would entertain any discussion on number 10, where folks fall out, why they voted the way they did. Looks like 3 of you said this was essential to include. 3 of you said don't include it, and the rest of you were somewhere in the middle.
I want to be mindful of my airtime, but I think what's coming up for me, why I would include it, like I'm thinking about standing with Standing Rock and just the racial implications of not talking about the environment and environmental justice, which is so inextricably linked to environmental racism. Like my family lives in Deanwood, open air coal. So it has some of the highest instances of asthma, bronchitis. And so if I'm interpreting this correctly, both in a local sense, a national sense, and a global sense, I do think it's imperative that and I don't know that I voted like this, but now that I'm reading it again, that we help students channel their skills towards topics related to the environment.
Other thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is Maria, and I agree. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I agree about the environment with number 10. I think students today, kids today are very much aware of their environment. They're very concerned about it. It permeates just about everything that they could possibly be interested in. So, I think it's important that we include that simply because they will understand it, they get it, and it's about their future. And for so long, we've tried to separate the environment from history. And I think we've reached a time and a place where it's come closer together.
Yep. I'm seeing a couple of folks' comments around the language of this being something that led them to vote in a particular way. So adjusting the language to really get into this sort of interplay and the impact of environmental degradation or pollution on populations of people, the connection of that to racism, the connection of that to historic inequities. When Sally and I talked, we talked about migration patterns and things like climate refugees, folks leaving rising sea levels, wildfire areas, et cetera. So I would invite, and Jessica, I might tap you if you've got a minute to make note of some of the language changes that might be helpful here. Looks like Karen, you might be willing to tag team on that, given your comment in the chat. So if I could ask for just a couple of language suggestions there, because I think there's a piece of this that's about activism for students, but there's also a piece of it about the knowledge, making sure that students have the content and history, as well as the geography and current events understanding of why there might be purpose to take action. So I'll ask you to drop in some thoughts in here. Karen, thanks for being willing to step up, and Jessica, maybe if anything sparks your fancy, feel free to chime in there.
Can I offer? Jessica,
Yeah.
can I offer one more thing though? So I'm someone who kind of put 2 on this for precisely those reasons, that it felt too vague for me. And as a social studies elementary social studies teacher, this would be a lot more clear and deliverable for me if I could interpret this in the context of like geography and economics, which we know definitely play into our choices regarding the environment. So that is language that would anchor me more in the content that I'm delivering. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So if I could tie the environmental and, if I could tie instruction around how we handle and manage and commodify the environment, I could link that to a larger study of economics and the larger study of geography.
Okay, Sarah, I'm going to tap you then too to drop a comment or some language in there on that, because I think you're right. I think here, this is a question not so much of the concept that folks disagree on, but the way in which the concept is outlined in the language here. Okay, so we have talked through a few up top. I want to just keep going here on our list of the others where consensus did not yet exist. So on I'm scrolling down to number 18. One of the suggestions here was to combine 18 with 20. In your rankings, there was more agreement on number 20. The language in number 20, folks voted largely either to advance this guiding principle, absolutely, or advance this guiding principle, yes. 18, a few of you objected to it. So take a look at the language for number 20. And let me know if you have any objection to us dropping number 18 and keeping number 20. And if there's anything you see that needs to be added or tweaked to 20 to make you okay with that. All right, let's start with any objections to dropping number 18. A couple shaking heads. Folks support combining. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead then and collapse this. Folks who had specific wording points here, whether about global identity or other language 18 that you wanted to see in 20, go ahead and just drop it in there using suggesting mode so that we have it and can clean that up as we go through. So the next place where there was a suggestion from folks to combine was on numbers 19 and 21. 19 is the orientation towards hard history, and then 21 was about a Western or Eurocentric perspective. When voting, there was pretty strong agreement on number 19. And quite a few more, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, thought we should drop it. So I'm getting that unstable internet note again. Take a look at 19 and 21 and see if there's an objection to dropping 21 and keeping 19. If there's any language you need us to add to 19 to make that okay with you, raise your hand or drop a note in the chat. Thanks to Lamar and Melanie for the suggestions on additional language to be added into 20. What do folks think about dropping 21 and anything that needs to be added into 19 to make that feel like it's reflective?
Just think for the Eurocentricity argument, we should be clear that this is about both like sort of geography and history. So, right, like, so when I think of geography, I mean, like, we're not just starting from Europe and like this becomes the East and this becomes the West, but also history means like, oh, West Africa had a history before it was colonized, right? So I think that's like pretty important to make sure we're identifying both of those parts of it, of like decentralizing Europe.
Okay. Did you drop that in to number 19 for us, Fidel, so that we get that in there? Looks like folks generally feel that there's clarity of the language in 19 over 21. Anyone who has additional suggestions for adding language to 19 or concerns about us dropping 21? Becca?
Not a concern, but just I know I was a little bit confused when I read the header about hard history, and I feel like it is becoming something else that is also cohesive. I don't have an answer, but I think this is the header needs to shift to capture what's underneath it.
Okay, it's a good push. Other pushes, questions? So Lamar, it feels okay that where we cover that in number 7 and maybe in the active voice one, that's okay?
Yes, because it feels, I understand the intention behind it. Like, we want to make sure that the focus is not put on the Eurocentric individuals, but we don't want to also take away from the fact that white supremacy was a part of many of those issues. So if we've already established in an earlier principle that we are being actively anti-racist, then we won't be de-emphasizing white supremacy if we're being actively anti-racist.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and remove 21. Which brings us to 2 open questions that we have not tackled yet. So the first is about specificity, organization, and consistency of the content. And this has to do with the themes that we talked about that are in the current standards, and how we deal with themes and our recommendations to OSSE and the writing committee about themes as well as disciplines that need to be included in the standards. OSSE asked a very specific question as we were approaching these guiding principles, and specifically said, What social studies disciplines should all students be exposed to by the time they graduate? And they offered some examples. What do we think constitutes the social studies disciplines for purposes of our standards? And then we talked about this question of themes, how the standards should be organized to allow teachers to group things thematically. What kind of information should be in the standards? So take a look at question 2 and the language that we put around that. And let's talk about this for a few minutes. Questions you have here, pieces that are missing, things we may not have captured, as well as your thoughts on the comments between some of your colleagues. Karen and Rebecca and Sally had a little bit of a comment chatter about incorporating humanitarian action and how we should represent military action, which is one of the themes in the current standards. So Scott's starting us off with using the C3 as our beginning start: civics, economics, geography, and history. Scott, one push I think I heard from a few folks in their spreadsheet of comments way back 3 meetings ago was this question about where the social sciences live. So where do we think about things like sociology? And does that get included or not as we're thinking about the disciplines?
I mean, I think it could be. I was gonna type that next, but I think, yeah, the C3 framework also includes in appendices anthropology, sociology, psychology, and then they've recently added religious studies. I think of those, religious studies in my mind would incorporate most with the others, the sort of the 4 major ones. The social sciences, again, my opinion on it, I feel like those tend to not show up in the required trajectory of courses as often in a K-12 space. They usually tend to show up more often as electives. And so I don't know if we are planning to encourage OSSE to write standards for elective courses. That is the case in some states. But I think as long as we have those 4 main ones in there, I think that's a good start, at least from my view.
Becca?
Yeah, I think just for clarity, like as someone who's been pushing for the social sciences, I'm really including everything that's not history because I think it's really easy to shift into thinking about writing history standards. I don't know what the magic number is, but I get when I start hearing them, like 7, 10, like I think that there is a point that is too much. And so I would err on the side of having fewer rather than more so that there's something that can be useful.
Jessica, when you say you would build on the list, are you thinking you would start with those 4 disciplines and use the themes to build on the list like the language does in the guiding principle, or we would add in additional disciplines like those typically included in the electives?
In my mind, I was thinking about additional disciplines, but I also think those themes are important. Like I would totally push for sociology and anthropology, maybe psychology, at the very least. If we're like being forward thinking, like I think my dilemma here is that I know I can't use the same thinking that got us to these standards. Like I want to think a little bit beyond where we are to really honor the culturally relevant approach that I committed to in the anti-racist approach. And I think some of my challenge is that some of the conversations are a little linear, which I find to be very rooted in cultures that don't honor anti-racist principles. I don't know how to say it, but I think we could stretch that list a little bit more in terms of this.
I appreciate that, Jessica. Karen, your note here suggests maybe we put this in the preamble. Do you want to say more?
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of well, I don't know if we want to open this can of worms yet, but I felt very strongly that the 3 bullets, and which I think is now 4, that are in the preamble, particularly as it was written before, but I still feel this way, to me, they are more like guiding principles. And if we're separating those out, it kind of becomes like we're saying those are ranked in a different way than the other principles or something. But aside from that, one way to maybe approach some of these questions would be the questions that OSSE had asked us, particularly for something like this question 2. Maybe that fits better in the preamble as opposed to as a principle.
Yeah. So Karen, speaking of the can of worms, and then Daniel, I'm going to come to you. The one thing to be cognizant of in the preamble is that the bullets about the threads those came explicitly from state board member feedback. And part of the reason they came explicitly from state board member feedback is that those are the items the state board identified in our resolution beginning this process of standards revision as key things we wanted new standards to do differently. So the reason they feature so prominently in the preamble is because they are prominent in the minds of the board members as elements we want to see advanced. So I think there's a couple ways we can handle it. When we come back to the preamble discussion, we could say these actually belong as principles. And since we've noted in the preamble that the guiding principles are in no particular order and all matter, then they're there. One thing you should know is that if we do that, you imagine that the board members may decide in their resolution, handing things on to OSSE, to nonetheless prioritize those themes they called out in the preamble. That's fine if the SISAC says the board can do that, but we are going to put this as principles on equal footing. But that's just a little context on where those initial bullets in the preamble came from and how they came to be there. Daniel, I want to turn to you for thoughts on this open question too.
I guess I just like some clarity. Are we thinking that these are disciplines like we'd want students to think about issues like a sociologist would or an anthropologist or a psychologist would, or just to be aware that these fields exist and have made contributions throughout history? Because I think those are 2 very different goals.
I don't want to be the arbiter of that answer. So it sounds like some of your colleagues think it's content, knowledge, and skills.
And I raise that too, just from a practical standpoint, that if you are trying to get students to think like sociologists or psychologists, I think that would be a really big lift for teachers. I don't think most teachers are trained as sociologists or even historians. So I think you have to think from an implementation standpoint is how are we actually getting this done?
Lizzie, do you have more on this? Because you seem to have a similar question.
No, I think Daniel articulated it really well. I think that's a really interesting question. Even if you're not a trained sociologist, is it possible to say a sociologist would see this issue this way? This is the lens that they would use. Also, to Jessica's point about us not thinking about this in a very like linear way or being tied to, always having the historical perspective or history being like the dominant discipline, introducing different lenses, getting students to think about there's various ways in which we can understand or view social phenomena, and these are the lenses. But I also agree with Daniel, like that's a really big lift. So I don't know how you square that. I don't know if this could be a whole other conversation, but just thinking out loud.
So let me offer an idea for consideration. The themes that are in the existing standards seem to be concrete enough that we may want to offer a guiding principle about the themes, including an expansion of language for the themes. This question of discipline seems to be about beginning from there are more. So social studies is more than just history, and putting our stake in the ground on the fact that it includes the 4 disciplines of the C3 as well as these other disciplines sociology, anthropology, psychology. And that perhaps that might best fit in the preamble to note that we expect that the standards include all of those things, and that we would like to see the writing committee consider a way to approach it from a lens perspective rather than a content perspective. What do folks think about that dichotomy? Keeping this principle focused on themes and moving disciplines, as well as this potential idea about the lens to the preamble. Becca?
This is just a clarifying question. Can you differentiate for me a little bit the difference between what's in the preamble and the guiding principles? Because to me, that line's starting to get a little bit blurry.
Well, I agree with you, Becca. I think it is getting to be a blurry line. I think the question I have is, the principles are things we have said to OSSE. We expect the standards to do these things. You standards writers are going to be writing, but this is what we want to see in there. This is how we want to see it. This is what we want to see included. The preamble was offered up as a suggestion of a sort of philosophical orientation that the SISAC wanted to give, to say, this is how we think about social studies. This is what we think this means. And the philosophical orientation we hope the writers will take as they include these concrete things. So for me, that's the place I'm coming with a dividing line, which is philosophical orienting principles versus concrete, make sure this is in there. If others have different opinions, open to hearing them. Sally, you had suggested the preamble. Karen, you've got a comment here. Certainly happy to make space for those.
My comment was just kind of offering up a maybe compromise or a suggestion of how to organize some of the guiding principles underneath the bulleted themes that are in the, or threads that are in the preamble, so that they're linked more meaningfully, because there are, I think, pretty clear and obvious linkages between those bulleted threads and a lot of the principles that we're highlighting.
And so when you say that, are you thinking like, I hate to be so concrete here, but like a visual linkage, like this bullet corresponds to guiding principles X, Y, and Z. This bullet corresponds to guiding principles 1, 2, and 3 in that way?
Yeah, or even more like literally visually, where you have the overarching bullet from the preamble with the 4 or so guiding principles that fit with that one. I don't know if all our guiding principles will fit with one of those, but it seems like we could easily link most of them, if not all, with one of those 4.
Okay. Other thoughts here on open question 2? I want to move us to open question 3. And then I actually want to make a quick switch in the agenda to have OSSE go next, so that while OSSE is talking through their process for the technical writing committee, I can do a little work in the doc here and clean some things up so we can see where we stand as we move towards the end of our time together tonight. All right, so let's come down to question 3, recognizing that open question 2 left us with a lot of new thoughts. Open question 3 is about an inquiry design model. This was language around how the C3 framework might play into the standards. When I take a look at how you rated open question 3, only about 25% of you felt like this was important to advance. So we had 5 folks put this as absolutely essential to advance. 5 folks say definitely don't advance, and the rest of you somewhere in the middle. If you are on the side of absolutely we've got to advance open question 3, I'd love to hear from you. And then I'd love to hear from someone who is like, absolutely not, this isn't that important.
Jessica, it's Mike. I'll speak as someone who voted for absolutely advance. Yeah, I mean, I just think that unless we have a framework around the idea of driving student learning and acquisition of knowledge through an inquiry design approach, then I worry that we're still going to have a very teacher heavy, my role is to cram as much information into your head as I possibly can. And I am simply a vehicle to distill it upon you approach with a lot of our curriculum. So, you know, when you want to talk about like big picture lifts, like pedagogy of the oppressed and stuff like that, I just think that it's really essential that we have a curriculum that comes out and believes in putting, as we've indicated in other places, but I think making it very explicit here, putting a lot of agency within the student themselves to have the skills and the ability to distill information and then arrive at their own conclusions and outcomes.
Scott?
Thanks. Yeah, I'll second everything that Mike just said, basically. But yeah, I agree. I think this one in particular, like using the C3 to say that language to put inquiry at the heart of the discipline of social studies or the content area of social studies, I think is really important. I do think that many other states, over 20 at the last count, have used language from the C3 framework to revise and update their standards. And I think that commonality is advantageous to us in DC because this is sort of the best thinking at the time it was released about the skills that students need to be engaging in to get towards that inquiry approach. I think the inquiry design model, that specific term relates to a particular format for designing a unit. I'm less tied to that particular term than the overall idea of the skills coming out of the C3 framework and the idea of inquiry at the heart.
Adal?
Yeah, I in complete agreement with what the last two folks have said. I just wanted to add that, like, I feel like the inquiry design model very much is an invaluable piece of democratizing curriculum building. And like our charge here is to largely create more culturally relevant pedagogy within social studies. And studies have shown that like that's like a necessary part for that to work and for it to be effective in classrooms. So I think like the inquiry design model is something that we should think of as a very important like stepping stone for like what we're trying to do here. Yeah.
So to the feedback folks are offering, and Daniel put an idea in the chat as well, is it the language around the inquiry design model? Is it something more of rooting the standards in inquiry design? Or is it rooting the standards in inquiry? Is it the concept that led folks to say not as important to advance? Or is it the language? Haven't heard from anybody who opposed it yet. So if anyone is willing to speak on that, it might be helpful to those folks who are in favor of.
Again, I'm a little confused because as someone who uses IDM, that seems like a teaching method. And granted, it's been a while, if I must confess, since I haven't read the social studies standards in a couple months since we first started, but I don't recall a lot of exploration of teaching methods. Correct me if I'm wrong. So I feel like IDM kind of would live with maybe strongly suggested teaching methods. But it feels to me like these standards are content standards. And if I've been missing the boat the past few months, get me back on track, y'all.
Well, I would say the same thing. I mean, that's my issue. I really don't disagree with anything that everybody has said. I would just say that I see that showing up more in curriculum than I do in standards. And I mean, as I was listening to people talk, I suppose I can see a place. I mean, it may be possible. I'm no expert on C3, but it may be possible for some of that to show up in the skills, if indeed, you know, the skills are kept separate from the content standards. So maybe that's a way to sort of thread this needle a little bit. I don't know the answer to whether or not that's possible, but it seems to me that it should be that they could possibly show up there. But mostly, I'm a stand for, you know, not trying to make a standards document explicit about instructional method and even instructional design.
It feels like the area here where there is agreement on is the connection of C3 to the skills. And that would also seem to play into an argument for having a separation between skills and content, not necessarily in an appendix where they're far away and hard to access, but rather that they not be treated as this content in conjunction with this skill and this content with this skill, but rather these are skills, this is content, and the skills rooted in the way the C3 approaches them. So that's where I'm hearing agreement. I'm going to spend a few minutes in the document while I give you over to Justin Tooley and Siobhan Gibson. I don't know who's going to present personally, but hand you over to them to talk a little bit about the writing committee while I jump in the document for a few minutes and try and clean up a few things, being mindful to not push us farther than we've had agreement in conversation. So I won't take too much editorial license, but I'm going to do a little cleaning. And Justin, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you again. I'm always here listening. Sometimes I've been very quiet here lately, but I've been here, and it sounds like you all are making extraordinary progress on getting these guiding principles together. I think it's been really interesting to see this come alive, and I'm glad that several months in the middle of a global pandemic, everyone's commitment has been very, very strong. And OSSE is really excited to hear what you have to say to us as we sort of continue on this journey together. We are very much committed to this work, even as we face fiscal budgetary constraints, and we're looking for a very busy and productive 2021. We're rolling out in 2020. We're going to move forward. So I'm not quite sure if Siobhan is on the line. I think she may have had another obligation. I see her icon, but maybe not her face. But I can go ahead. And I'll just share my screen. So let's see here. Screen share. All right. So can everybody see? All right. So tonight we wanted to give you an update on how we're thinking about our formation of the writing committee, of the technical writing committee. So we wanted to provide a timeline of some of our next steps. And then we also wanted to give you the opportunity to engage with us and provide us some feedback about provide feedback about feedback loops. So how should we think about updating this advisory committee going forward with our work? So first, what is the OSSE Technical Writing Committee? So as we sort of set up with the state board when we started to think about this work, is that your advisory committee would provide the guiding principles that you've been thinking about for the past few months to give us direction of how to review, revise, rewrite the standards. We put all of that on the table and wanted to sort of use you to give us some directionality of where we should think about in our writing process. So we envision putting together a committee of K-12 educationers and practitioners. By practitioners, we do contemplate having higher education people, representatives on the writing committee, one, to ensure sort of vertical alignment with college and career readiness, but also to provide us with historical expertise and also instructional expertise on the writing committee. We're looking for a writing committee of about 30 to 35 participants. Our work is aimed to begin in February 2020 and last through August of 2020, or February 2021, August 2021. So not a lot of time, but will take up probably the greatest part of next year. We look to, this is a typo, our application will open in December 2020. So I will also give you a glimpse of what we're asking applicants that are interested in joining the writing committee to do. And I'll show you that at the end of the presentation. We are also looking to organize our writing committee by grade bands of expertise. So those grade bands would be grades K through 2, grades 3 through 5, grades 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12. We will, based on sort of the direction that you give us with the guiding principles, we may adjust the number of people that are represented in each grade band. We don't have like a firm commitment of how many in each category. It'll be based on sort of the needs where we're going to have to do some of the most work. So that's like a general overview of the structure of our writing committee. So next, roles and responsibilities. So we're going to ask, it is a significant lift, and it's also a significant lift that it is also dependent on what you all sort of advise us to do. It sounds like from the conversation that I was listening to tonight that it's not a wholesale rewrite of standards, like trash the other ones and start again, which is good, but it's still a lot of work. So we've estimated about 15 to 20 hours of work over 7 months. Some weeks will be slower, some months might be slower, but that's our estimate from other states that have engaged in this work. And during that process, the writing committee members will receive professional development on high quality social studies standards. They will review the existing standards and draft new standards in sort of a workshop model. And they will do that work from February 21 to August 21 with a lot of intensive engagement during the summer. Again, we will divide into grade bands based on expertise. We will, and this will be a robust and iterative process in learning, drafting, and revising. And there may also be opportunities for leadership in the technical writing committee for individuals that decide to work with us. So again, like we are looking for people that are not only passionate about social studies, but are looking for a high quality professional development experience deep in sort of in curriculum instruction in the social studies. This is not sort of a breeze in, breeze out type committee experience. This is like a really in-depth experience where people will be asked to come. It'll be in a virtual environment for the most, we'll have to do it in a virtual environment, but there will be, you'll be working with us, you'll be working independently and coming back, and you'll be working with your peers. So it's a highly intensive iterative process that we will be engaging in. So timeline. So where do we go from here? Again, I should have copy edited a little bit better. Timeline, we hope to go live with our application in December and close it in January so we can begin our committee in February 2021. Again, we will begin our work in February 21 and estimate going through August in sort of doing sort of the revision and writing process. And then we will come back to you in the state board with our revised rewritten standards and sort of continue on our public comment and feedback loops to sort of move towards approval in later on in the process. Let's see here. I think I'm still going to share my screen, but yes. So the application. So this is just, I'm going to give you sort of an overview of what you'll be asked to do, what an applicant would be asked to do. So you just see a general welcome statement. You give us like full name, school organization, your direct supervisor's name and email address, where you can be reached, your contact information. You'll give us a little bit of information about about your past employment experience in the past 3 years. And then we have a few questions that we hope aren't a heavy lift for people, but can really help us sort of assess people, the skill set and interest that the applicants have in our writing, for our writing committee. So one is just please provide a summary of the subject matter courses you have taught in the past 3 years, no more than 300 words. Describe your experience at developing standards and curriculum in the area in which you teach, no more than 300 words. Then we ask for using the current DC social studies standards. You have an option here. So identify a standard that needs revision, explain how and why that standard should be revised, or you can upload a lesson of how you teach a particular DC standard. And then lastly, sort of your individual talent and skills that you're going to bring to the writing process. And then if you would be comfortable in sort of leading a group as we think about organization. So not a heavy lift on application, takes a little bit of time, but enough to get sort of a sense of people's interests, people's skill set, and thinking about this. I'm going to stop sharing. I think. Stop share. And okay. So we had a few questions. So I think the first piece is, are there any questions generally about process of sort of how we're moving from where we are now to the writing committee? I'll take those questions first. If you want to put them in the chat, I can also see the chat. I think there's a question here is, what does professional development entail? So I can speak a little bit to that. So we are right now working on identifying a contractor to help us do a lot of the work of facilitating the writing committee. We are looking for a contractor that can provide us with module experiences to help us get to bring what you have advised us to do to life, to sort of onboard people into our standards, and then also workshop the group to getting to the new draft of the standards. We believe that that's a pretty significant professional development experience of, one, learning about the standards, learning in depth about how standards are written, how standards are organized, and then also just sort of the writing workshop process and working with peers. We believe that that's a pretty significant professional development experience for anybody that chooses to work with us. Are there other questions? I see Siobhan. I hope, Siobhan, I have not completely derailed your presentation. But.
No, that was great, Justin. Sorry, all. I had a conflicting meeting, so I had to pop in and pop out, but you were in good hands with Justin. Justin, there are a couple more questions in the chat I'll just call out. Given the big time commitment, are people being compensated? If not, how is that going to impact who can join and what voices will be in the room? So there is not a financial stipend for this work. We view this as a professional learning opportunity, as we previously mentioned. OSSE will provide professional learning units to individuals who hold DC credentials, and those professional learning units can be used towards renewal of the credential. So the time is, and then Barbara says you're saying 30 people times 20 hours per week for 7 months. So that's 16,800 hours of time in writing. So it's not all time in writing. As Justin mentioned, it is an iterative process. So there will be learning about the standards process, looking at the standards to see what works. There will be a spotlight on the guiding principles, ensuring that those are addressed in the revisions or the standards that are written. So it's an iterative process. It's not that any individual will be writing all that time. There will be separate grade band meetings. There will be conversations about vertical alignment. So there's a combination of activities that amount in that time. Justin and I also didn't make up these numbers. This is really after talking to 6 or 7 different states that have done social studies revisions in the past, like 2 to 3 years. And that is where they landed on average about time commitment.
We also did sort of an upward bound on that, depending, because we're still unclear, and this is no fault of anybody else's, just sort of what sort of the demands are going to be on the standards, like a whole. It looks like that you all are moving in a direction of some thoughtful revisions instead of like a wholesale rewrite. But we just wanted to provide sort of an upward bound estimate. We felt it was better for people to say, oh, this wasn't that as much time as they initially told me, instead of going, whoa, this is way more of a commitment than I thought it was going to be. I think Fadal has a question. Just wrote.
Thank you for giving us these details, by the way. My question still kind of branches off the two questions that have been asked. It seems pretty important that like people who are currently teaching are part of this committee. But I just feel like with this time commitment, even if like this ends up being a little lower than this or exactly at this, like it seems like pretty impractical for people who are currently teaching. Like the average data from the DOE says the average teacher spends like 50 hours a week working, and people who would sign up for this probably are spending even more time a week working. So I'm just wondering, like, are you guys planning on having people who are currently teaching on the committee? And if so, like, what are we doing to like make sure that they can do this reasonably?
So I can answer that. I mean, one is, yes, current teachers are more than welcome to apply. Two, we wanted to be very straightforward with everybody that's applying of what the lift was. I feel also when we began to think about doing this work, like from the very beginning, we're like, a standards rewrite in-house on your own is a significant lift. We are bringing in people to help us facilitate that, because even on our end, like this is a massive undertaking. There's nothing, like, we wanted to write the standards. This is what we estimate is going to be the lift to do it, and to do it well, and to do it in a thoughtful and deliberative manner to sort of deliver what everybody wanted us to do. I think from there, I don't really know. Siobhan, do you have anything else to add?
I mean, I also, Fadal, support a number of initiatives around teacher wellness. So I completely understand your question about capacity. Again, in the states that we spoke with, when they underestimated time, they had a number of individuals say, sure, sign me up. And folks had very impressive resumes and were leaders in their districts around this work. And then when the work picked up, those individuals somehow trickled off. And some of the cautionary tales that we were told by our colleagues in other states is you really should, in many cases, perhaps even overestimate the commitment. So you get people who look at this as a meaningful task that's going to require time and effort. In the cases where they had tighter time constraints, just based on legislation being passed or what have you, they said they wound up doing some cursory revisions and that was it. So I think the guiding principles here, if there are going to be a very robust set of guiding principles, which I'm really excited to see and listen in on these conversations, it's going to require some work to get these over the finish line. The timeline that was provided to us has us completing this work by next fall. So hence why we have the condensed time frame.
I think there was another question about what percentage of different types of roles are you aiming for? We are looking for mostly people that are practitioners in the K-12 space, but also having a few people in higher ed to sort of guide vertical alignment, and also some additional work in sort of content.
There's another question from Karen about breaking up the time commitment during the school year, how many hours a week, and maybe how many hours a week in the intensive summer commitment. Again, Karen, we gave estimates because Justin and I will not single-handedly be leading the training. Again, we're looking for a consultant to do this work. So we will work closely with the consultant to outline that. At this time, the contract has not been awarded, so that's why we're giving estimates of the work. Does the professional development entail anti-racism and culturally relevant pedagogy training? Ms. Rucker, yes, we have asked that the training be comprehensive about all forms of pedagogy. And based on when we wrote the scope of work, we recognized that this group was very eager to represent anti-racist education and culturally responsive pedagogy. So we did include that, and we'll similarly continue to work with the vendor once chosen to ensure that the professional development does entail that. Thank you for that flag and question. Is the consultant a trainer about how to write standards or responsible for moving the document forward? So the trainer, Ms. Davidson, is a consultant about writing the standards and getting the standards to the point of public comment. Moving the document forward is, again, the coordinated effort between Jess and the state board and Justin and I from OSSE.
I'm not sure I understand. So having done a lot of this and having running a company that would be a candidate for consulting, but isn't this time, at no interest in, in this work, but having done a lot of it in the past, who's the sort of the neck to grab? who's ultimately these practitioner writers and others are really, in order to do their work, going to have to sort of be responding to things that are queued up for them. Who's setting agendas for meetings of these people? Who's tasking them with the next thing that needs to be done? Who's coordinating across the different grade band teams? All separate sort of and apart from training them about what constitute good standards and looking at what these guiding principles need to how they're going to show up in actual standards and so forth. Is that your team, or is that something that the consultant is doing? I mean, it seems to me, I'm asking because I think it may help us to feel better about what the the burden or the opportunity is for these the writing team.
I think I heard two questions. Let me repeat back what I think I heard. It sounds like the first part of your question is who is tasking the technical writing committee along the way. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's good.
Yep. So tasking the writing committee is going to be the consultant supported by Justin and I along the way. Can you repeat the second part of your question?
Oh, I don't know that there was, no, that's the primary question. Who's responsible for meeting deadlines, and the overall, coherence in the document.
Yep, so that's part of, so when we mentioned there are opportunities for leadership potential, individuals who express that is an interest of theirs would be tasked with some of the coherence. We also expect that's where we can lean on some of our higher education and community partners to support the coherence and vertical alignment as well.
Thank you.
I see another question from Scott about the possibility for additional funding to support a stipend, and he gives an example of the premium rate that DCPS pays teachers to do that. And again, another note about it being a tough sell to get this 30 to 35 people with full-time jobs. Scott, as a DC government employee, you well know the precarious situation we're in with budget. Justin and I are shaking every tree possible to try to get funding out. But it is quite possible that we may not be able to get funding, which is why we have not made that overture. Our budget is also not finalized yet, and there may be additional cuts coming. So we well appreciate the burden that this is, but with our budget situation, it simply may not be possible to stipend, particularly at the rate in which you just mentioned.
And to also make the investment in just doing the initial work that we
that we have to do on the standards too. It's like OSSE is also using limit like our funds to also carry on to keep this work going and to support the work going forward. This is evolving.
I want to thank you both, Justin and Siobhan, for coming to present tonight and for being willing to entertain all the questions. It sounds like the sort of outstanding themes are that folks worry about and have offered up concerns around getting K-12 educators on the timeline expected without some certainty around being able to force a lot of those hours into summer and or without the possibility of compensation. So I don't know, like you said, obviously these were all known constraints that I do hope that you know, that came through loud and clear. That was sort of my two big takeaways from this crew. I do want to pull folks back for a moment to the guiding principles. We have 7 minutes and I just want to talk through where we are not, and what that means for what remains to be done. But I really appreciate, Justin and Siobhan, you hanging with us tonight and providing those details about the writing committee. So I would invite you all to go back and look at the document for a minute. I'm gonna not share my screen so I can see your faces for a few minutes, if that's okay, because I want to talk through where we are. So as I see it, there are two very big questions remaining for us to talk about. And then there are other smaller things remaining for us to talk about. And when I say remaining for us to talk about, I mean, before I feel good about putting this out to the public. So in the presentation deck we shared, we talked about how we were going to share this with the public. And the plan was to give the public 2 full weeks to read through a final draft of guiding principles and vote on a Likert scale, very similar to the one you voted on tonight, with the one key change being that instead of doing 3 categories of voting, we give them 4. Do we agree, strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree with these particular principles? The hope is that giving those folks 2 weeks to do that is sort of a standard expectation of how we engage people, plus running up against Thanksgiving, plus making sure that we could get you feedback and the state board feedback to work into the timeline of the working session. So lots of barriers not of our making that surround this timeline. Before I feel good about putting this out to the public, there are 2 things I want to make sure we are good on. One is I am not inclined to put the preamble out to the public. I think there's a lot of work that we still need to do around what goes into the preamble. So I would vote for not putting the preamble out to the public, but rather us continuing to work on that asynchronously in the document, having some conversations, and not putting that out for public consumption now. Is there anyone who objects strongly and thinks that the public absolutely must see our preamble as part of their feedback? Vidal, is that a hand for this time or for other things? No worries. I teach on Zoom every week too, so like I get in the habit of forgetting to put my own hand down in meetings and noticing when my students don't.
I would maybe suggest the bullets in the preamble be included in something for public discussion or feedback.
How would you want us to do that, Karen? Like I know you feel strongly that these bullets belong as guiding principles. And I know there's a few folks who agree with you. I don't know if others, I mean, maybe that's something we spend a couple minutes on now. How do folks feel about these bullets being their own guiding principles? We're at 21 guiding principles now. Some of these fit with others, but would make them substantially longer. Karen, do you want to give your rationale for why you think they belong as their own principles?
Yeah, I guess, well, even if they aren't their own principles, I think because they're overarching threads. Oh, sorry.
He has a strong opinion about this.
He's very opinionated. Because they're overarching threads that the state board has also identified as being important, I think any feedback the public might have about that would be really useful. And yeah.
Other thoughts on that? Karen Lee, you have a thought about, we've moved some things to the preamble and therefore it needs to be part of the feedback.
It just seems like part of the process was seeing like if we could move things around, and some of that got moved into the preamble. So if we're trying to hold the integrity of what we were holding as guiding principles, that the preamble part now has become a part of the full document. I'm not sure it's fair to separate it out when we used it as a full document when talking about it.
Okay. So one question then, just that is tactical. There are actually two tactical questions. One is timing. In order to get to a preamble that resolves some of the comments and questions in there now, we would not be able to put this out for public comment this Friday. The earliest I could see doing that is probably sometime next week, giving the rest of this week to reach out to you all, get your feedback, put it together and get people's feedback. So it involves a shorter timeline for public comment. The second thing is that our public comment form is meant to be streamlined so that we could quickly analyze the feedback, and analyzing hundreds of text comments is not something that can happen in a quick time frame. So we had done the Likert scale voting as an opportunity for people to tell me about the guiding principles. If we did the preamble, I would at the very least think it made sense to include a, do you have comments to offer on the preamble? Maybe we get very little public comment and then we have very few comments to analyze. But if we're doing our jobs, we're pushing it out there to get more public comment, and it will limit our ability to do that. We did robust public comment on the sort of general questions around the social studies standards. And we did get back hundreds of responses, and it did take quite a while to compile and collate. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, again, the time frame, and I want to emphasize, part of the time frame we're working with is that OSSE has made the commitment to keep this work going, does have an open call for contracts out, is planning to assemble this writing group beginning in January. So we've got to vote on this at the December public meeting for the state board in order to make everything keep going. Anything we don't do pushes it all back, and pushes it back substantially, sort of creating a bit of a domino effect. So I'm trying very hard to avoid voting after December, because you all committed to work monthly through December, and the contract is out to get that writing group started in January.
Do the guiding principles have to receive public comment?
I suppose that's a question for your group. We had committed to doing it.
I mean, it seems to me that we've gotten quite a lot of input about from the public about what they want from the standards. I mean, in the comments that they've provided, there's going to be lots of opportunity going down the road, for them to comment. I mean, I could make an argument that says that these guiding principles are our effort to, and this is a representative group, that the public has had an opportunity to inform it, and that we who have struggled with this, engaged in productive struggle over issues that are nuanced and and hard and all of that. Why not put your faith in the process that's been laid out?
Barbara, I'm just going to hit pause. So it's 7:01, and I know folks are committed to be here till 7. So if you need to go, please feel free to go. We will not put anything out before we have sent it out in writing to the committee. I want to encourage this. So I think that's an open question. Do we need public comment on this or not? The other option is folks can come to the state board meeting. They can come to the December public meeting when it is in final format before the board, ready for a resolution. They can submit written comment or come in person for that. So I think that is a reasonable option. The second open question is around the standards and grade bands. And I think there it's a wording process, and I will need to get folks input on that. Alex and John Paul, what I don't want to do is rush this. So I want to recommend that we regroup as a team. We consider the possible paths forward, and we work with folks asynchronously over email to establish the next process and make sure that we've got agreement from folks before we move ahead. Is that acceptable? Okay.
Yeah,
great. I'm
that's
seeing
acceptable.
nodding. All right. I thank you all for hanging with me tonight. Keep comments going in the document, and we'll be back in touch over email tomorrow. Thursday. Tomorrow's a Veterans Day holiday. Good night, all. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica. Night,